everybody. I am Shelley Rogers, and I am part of the web team here at Liberty Fund. It is our pleasure to have you join us today for the latest installment of From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling. Before I get started and turning it over to Arnold, I'd like to introduce our panelists, Rachel Liu and Matthew Continetti. In about 20 to 30 minutes, we are going to turn it over to our viewing audience to ask questions live. If you'd like to put your pre-questions into the Q&A, I will go ahead and moderate those as well. Arnold, take it away.
Okay, well, I'm going to actually skip over introducing, but feel free to throw in an introduction. But so we're talking today about a book that has over a dozen authors of essays. And their main point seems to be that the conservative establishment has let down the conservative movement, and it needs a more aggressive stance. So the indictment might be that the indictment that they're making is in some sense that conservatives have failed to conserve. So I'd like to start by asking Rachel a question about has the conservative establishment failed to conserve in the field of sort of family values, social conservatism in general? I think that you can make a pretty strong case that, you know, the American family is in disarray and that public policy is very much skewed against kind of normal families and against religion. I mean, you can't have a Christian display in the public square, but you can have a drag queen story hour in a public library. So is the indictment of mainstream conservatism having failed to conserve in the area of social conservatism, is that a valid indictment?
Well, I don't really think that the right, any part of the right, has been really delighted with the direction that things have been going with respect to the family and that aspect of our culture for a long time. We've had a lot of concerns about it for many decades, and I think very few people would see where we've gotten to now as a good case scenario. I think the bigger question to ask to some of these new right critics is, what are the real causes of that? Is it possible that there are some sort of bigger picture forces at work here that we just haven't really figured out good responses to yet, right? Maybe the world is changing in certain ways, and it's just kind of difficult to figure out how we should adapt and change in response to that. But I think the real question that you end up having to ask them is, are they offering anything that's very new at all? Because it seems to me like most of the suggestions and ideas that they're throwing out are things that have been part of the conservative establishment that has apparently failed to conserve anything for a long time now, right? So I mean, I think they've conserved, you know, something. I think that America could be in worse shape than it's presently in. But if you're unhappy with where America is now, then you're going to have to ask, what are the broader reasons for that? And does the new right really have anything new to put on the table in response to that?
Okay. Let me throw a different question at Matt, which is, where do these authors fit in the kind of long tradition of sort of intra-conservative battles within the conservative movement? Can you draw a line back to anyone in particular, or is this something really new? Well, you have to unmute, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out, Arnold, and thank you for having me, and to Liberty Fund and to Rachel. It's nice to be here. There's always been a criticism internal to the American right suggesting that either the mainstream of American conservatism overly favors the traditional side or the libertarian side of conservatism, or the critique goes, conservatism hasn't been effective, it hasn't fought hard enough, it hasn't arrested the progress of the left. And we can look back for much of the history of the American conservative movement and see that critique going on. I would say, just to briefly touch on the first question, It all depends on what you're trying to conserve. And for the American conservative movement, born in my view in the 1930s as a resistance to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, and then revived after World War II in a crusade against global communism, I actually think that the American conservative movement has some real successes to point to. Most importantly was its role in stiffening the spine of the American government in its relations and its confrontation with the Soviet Union, putting the pressure eventually that helped speed the collapse of the Soviet Union, a great victory for conservatism. I also think that if it weren't for the American conservative movement, the American political economic landscape would look much different than it does today. It has been American conservatives who continually point to the written Constitution and to the Declaration of Independence as a way of saying that, you know, those social democratic societies of Europe, that's not how we do things in America. We have a founding, we have ideals, we have institutions that were set up by the founders, and we should respect all of that. We should conserve all of that vis-a-vis the programs and planning of liberal Democrats or the progressive left. I'd also say it's ironic to me as a reader of this book that we're discussing today that it appeared at a moment in between two highly significant Supreme Court decisions. In 2022, we had the Dobbs decision, which reversed the holding of Roe v. Wade, a 50-year precedent establishing a right to abortion at any point in a pregnancy, and remanding the issue basically to the states or to the political sphere more broadly. This has been a long-standing concern of the American conservative movement, especially of the pro-life movement, which belongs to that conservative movement, and a huge victory. And then more recently, we had the holdings in the affirmative action cases, the Duke and Harvard cases, where the Supreme Court overturned the Bakke decision, allowing for race-based affirmative action in college admissions. Again, a major concern domestically of the American right for many years. So I think it's odd that at this moment of triumph in the legal sphere, the authors and contributors to the volume would say that conservatism has no victories. And just briefly, though, where it stands, I would point out to an interesting oddity of this book, which is that the book was published under the auspices of the Claremont Institute. The Claremont Institute was founded in the late 1970s to promote the teachings of the philosopher Harry Jaffa. Harry Jaffa believed that Lincoln was the greatest statesman, possibly in world history. He believed that the equality clause, all men are created equal, in the Declaration of Independence, were the most important words written since the Christian New Testament. And he had a very strong belief in the importance of immigration and in the importance of America standing up for its ideals abroad. However, Jaffa's name does not appear in this book. And the name that does appear more often is the name Patrick Buchanan, who was the leader of the paleoconservative faction on the American right, a faction that, up until the past few years, conceived of itself in diametric opposition to Harry Jaffa and to the Claremont Institute. And so here's an additional irony about this volume, which is that it, in its own way, reflects happenings on the American right away from the more idealistic picture of Harry Jaffa toward the more pessimistic vision of Patrick Buchanan.
Can I add something here as well?
Sure.
Sorry. We're talking about my question now, right? But I also actually found it really interesting in this volume, and I was thinking about this last week. It says almost nothing about the pro-life movement. So we hear a lot about all of the things they failed to conserve at the level of the family. But there's almost nothing about the pro-life movement, and that was disappointing to me, because I am actually very interested in the question of what the pro-life movement should be doing now, where it should be trying to go. I kind of wanted to know what these new right thinkers thought about that, but they don't really say almost anything about it. And so there's a couple of things about that. One is that I do think the pro-life movement is the most magnificent example of something that the old right did, or conservatism did, that had enormous impacts on American society, not just as Matt just mentioned, a lot of legal victories at the highest federal levels, at lower levels, at state levels, local levels. The pro-life movement has been pretty amazing in many ways, but also as a force for cultural change. I think it really has impacted an enormous number of people and took a social question that many people really thought was settled and didn't allow it to be settled, right? So that's had a very big impact on our society. They don't even really talk about it. So that's kind of interesting in itself, and to me kind of indicates, well, most obviously that they seem to be wanting to sort of deliberately look away from anything that might give any credence to conservatism over the past few decades. But I'm also a little bit worried that the new right itself seems to be pivoting away from the natural law principles that the pro-life movement represented. And that's something I think religious conservatives should be very concerned about at this moment.
So what principles, I mean, you know, how do these principles apply to issues other than abortion? And so what do you see happening there? You have done. Yeah.
You mean the pro-life movement's principles?
Well, no, yeah. So let's bracket aside the pro-life movement. You said that this new right is turning away from natural law principles.
I see.
Elaborate on that.
Yeah, well, I think in the older Reaganite coalition, it was sort of understood that the moral conservatism piece of that, right, was largely upheld by traditionalists and religious conservatives, not exclusively, but they were certainly the kind of primary group that was carrying on that tradition and making that contribution to the rights coalition. And that was one that was very much rooted in a natural law sort of understanding, right? So what do those principles involve? Well, they involve a certain appreciation of personhood and why human beings are important. And also can be extended outwards to citizenship, questions about access in a free society, and so on and so forth, but always rooted in some deeper understanding of the value of human beings, right? And I think that was actually developed pretty well, not only through the pro-life movement, but through other aspects of moral conservatism. And in the new right, I think there are definitely people in this volume that are basically old line religious conservatives kind of trying a new thing. Scott Yenner is an obvious example. I think he's clearly a fairly familiar form of social conservative who's just frustrated that they haven't made as many gains as he would like. But I think that there's other people in this volume, Richard Hanania, I don't know how you say his name, or Michael Anton. Actually, Helen Andrews is interesting because she really hangs with social conservatives, but I don't really get that vibe from her. The kinds of arguments that she's making seem to be more rooted in sort of sociobiological and other and kind of postmodern types of reasoning that to me don't really take a natural law foundation as being fundamental, but more are looking towards some sort of postmodern or even Nietzschean type of reasoning. And I think you see this coming up a lot more often on the new right. There's this kind of postmodern realism to a lot of their arguments that doesn't really seem to presume that human dignity or human personhood are kind of our fundamental guiding North Star.
Okay, let's go back to a point that Matt made about the conservative movement sort of bolstering the anti-communist cause. I think the new right would say that probably that was a good thing, but that injected conservatism into a kind of an interventionist mode that they didn't back out of after the Soviet Union fell. And, you know, I guess George Bush, before he became president, said, I don't believe in nation building, but then when it had a complete reversal after 9/11. And since 9/11, the charge that the new right would make is that the conservatives have just been too pro-interventionist. Matt, what do you make of that charge?
I think it's a fair charge. I mean, that's a substantive disagreement about how engaged America should be in the world. I would step back and say that this is part of a larger development on the American right. I'm not the first to point out that in many ways, the new right, or America's right as reflected in the Republican Party today, harkens back to an earlier Republican Party. If you look at the policy areas of, say, immigration, trade, and intervention. Donald Trump's GOP is kind of similar to Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge's GOP. The GOP of the 1920s was all for free markets, but within the United States. Otherwise, it was generally supportive of the tariff. It was certainly restrictionist when it came to immigration. The immigration ban happened in 1925, I believe, 1926, which cut off immigration to the United States for 40 years. And then in terms of America's role in the world, the GOP in 1920 stood for normalcy, by which Warren Harding meant a rejection of Wilsonian engagement in Europe, intervention in the Great War, and all of the secondary effects of that intervention, whether it was the influenza pandemic, whether it was the inflation that came with our involvement, whether it was the suppression of dissident opinion within the United States. All of this spurred a reaction which the GOP of the 1920s capitalized on in their great victories. So I think you can see something similar today taking place in the Republican Party. What's funny is that the victory in the Cold War kind of came as a surprise to many people. The one person who wasn't surprised was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the New York senator, who in the early 80s said that he had studied the figures and came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was in a terminal decline. But for most other people, it was quite sudden, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so a debate took place on the American right about how conservatives should respond to this new position the United States found herself in, which was the sole superpower. That debate was, for a time, decided on behalf of the engagers or the interventionists, right? But beginning in Barack Obama's second term, I'd say you could even see it with the attitudes of many congressional Republicans toward Obama's intervention in Libya. There are many congressional Republicans skeptical of that intervention. The GOP has kind of walked away from its earlier view that America's position as superpower demands of it certain actions and responsibilities on the world stage, which would lead to greater intervention. And now we're at a place where, under Donald Trump, the slogan is America First, which had been the slogan of the America First Committee in 1940 and 1941, opposing American entry into World War II. So I'd say that charge is fair. I think that's a substantive debate. And right now, the opponents of intervention have the upper hand in the GOP.
Okay. So can either of you comment on any of the specific proposals that come out of the book? Or which proposals sort of most appealed to you and which most repelled you? Let's start with Rachel.
Trying to think of concrete proposals that appealed to me. I mean, I think there are a lot of essays in this book that are trying to be practical in their recommendations, although the aim of all of those recommendations is just to sort of diminish the power of the progressive left.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I guess I should have a sort of list offhand on, are any of those ideas reasonable? Some of them clearly just involve trying to seize the levers of power and use them to punish our enemies. But I guess I didn't do the sort of breakdown of exactly where all of those suggestions fall along the spectrum. Some of the things they're suggesting are things that conservatives have wanted for a long time, right? Let's try to diminish the administrative state's power over our local schools or things like that. Well, that's reasonable, though it's not very new, but some of those ideas are reasonable. In a lot of cases, they don't really have a lot of policy suggestions, though, right? I mean, or if they are, so for instance, in Jeremy Carl's immigration essay, he kind of throws out scattershot a whole bunch of different ideas, but none of them are really developed. James Polos tells us that we need to have a digital bill of rights to define what people's rights are in social media and on the internet. That might be interesting, but I would be interested to hear what would that include? How do we go about doing that? It's not really clear what that's actually going to amount to, so I can't really comment on it at any length.
Anything in particular repel you? Anything strike you as sort of, this is not a good policy idea?
Well, there are many things in there that are not good policy ideas. I think, and many of the things in here are just kind of strange. So Jenner and Milikh have an essay on taking back the schools, right? And it channels a theme that we see a lot in this, which is basically, well, we can't actually aim for limited government or any kind of diffuse federalist type of solution. We need to just win the argument, right? Like the things like school choice are a mistake because that's just avoiding the showdown that we need to have. What we need to do is just seize control somehow. And then he says, once we do that, then we need to implement a new curriculum. And they're very interested in like physical education. And they say that we need to have people building obstacle courses. And then he says, every male student could learn to skin an animal and every female to milk a cow. I'm like, okay. I guess that's fine. I don't really, it's just, so many of the suggestions are just quite strange, right? But there's others among them that, Michael Anton wants us to have a reset or something on our relations with Russia because he thinks that Russia is really kind of a natural, he doesn't say a natural ally, but that really as part of the sort of Western world, it makes sense for us to be on better terms with Russia. He points out that Russian music plays in our concert halls all the time, and we just need to sort of accept that they have some imperial ambitions that we're not very comfortable with. That's just the way it is, and move on and try to make better friends with them. Well, that strikes me as a very bad idea. So yeah, there are many suggestions in the book that some just weird, like teaching all of the girls to milk cows, and others of them like trying to make better friends with Russia that seem fairly repugnant. Yeah.
Okay, Matt, how would you answer that? Things that appealed to you or things that repelled you that were on the more specific?
Well, I was also struck, as Rachel was, that as I read the book, the beginnings of the essays were all Jeremiah's, all scolding, all lamenting the state of the country, attacking the conservative movement, attacking the Republican Party, and raising quite radical questions and claims about the American project and about our condition as a society and our place in the world. But by the end of the essays, the list of proposals were things that I had no intellectual problem with at all. As a conservative, I want to constrain and reduce the size of government. That includes the administrative state. As a conservative, I want bureaucracies to be accountable to the people's elected representatives. That means empowering Congress, forcing Congress to do its job. As a conservative, I want us to address the social impacts of migration, which we see playing out everywhere, and which in places like Chicago and New York City, I think illuminate a host of public policy problems brought to us by the progressive left. And that can be addressed in the case of the right to shelter or lack of work opportunities through market mechanisms. So I had this experience again and again. I would say that the passage that Rachel pointed out about men learning how to skin an animal and women learning how to milk a cow struck me as simply odd. Not just odd in its content, but reflective of a capital R romantic vision of society in the world, a vision of society that is, I hate to say this, but gone. That's not the society we live in. You don't actually need to know how to milk a cow. to flourish in the 21st century. And I actually think it's conservative to say that that's just the facts. I think as conservatives, we have to deal with the world we inherit. We appreciate that inheritance and we want to build on it. So that did strike me as odd. On Russia, again, I don't think it's even possible for us to have a rapprochement with Russia, because Russia has a decision too, and they also have agency. And Putin has no interest in a rapprochement with us, no matter what he says. I will say, though, I was mildly sympathetic to Anton's claim that just because America is in this competition with Russia, in this fight with Russia over Ukraine, that shouldn't lead us to cancel Russian culture. And there have been some excesses, I think, on the left, where concerts of Russian composers are being canceled in the West, and I think that is an overreach. And I think one can both appreciate Russian culture and the amazing achievements that Russian writers and composers and filmmakers have made over the centuries, while condemning the actions of its current government.
Although I have to say, I agree, I've always felt that way, but till now I always thought, well, canceling the Russian concerts and not reading Tolstoy is ridiculous. Who out there would think, just because we like Tolstoy, that we need to support Russia's imperial geopolitical ambitions? But apparently there are some people who think that. So that part was unfortunate.
Let me ask about specifically, Richard, I guess it's Hanania's proposal that by executive order end affirmative action for government in government hiring and ending requirements for government contractors. That seems kind of bold and yet hard, perhaps difficult to argue with. So any comments on those ideas? Start with Rachel. Can I go ahead? Yeah.
You should probably let Matt comment on the practicalities of the thing.
Well, I would say it's fitting in the reliance on executive power that does come across in several of these essays. There has been a shift, I think, and it's long running on the American right, and its attitudes toward the executive and the presidency. And for many years, beginning in the 1930s and extending for many years after, the American right was on the side of Congress and felt that the problem was with American government was that too much power was concentrated in Washington. Too much power in Washington was concentrated in the executive, and then too much power was delegated from the executive to the bureaucracies. And so the conservatives warned against what James Burnham called Caesarism, and they thought that Congress should play its part in constraining the executive, both in the domestic affairs as well as foreign affairs. Since really the Nixon presidency, but extending throughout all the Republican presidencies subsequent to that, there's been a shift to a reliance on the executive, a feeling that only a strong executive, a strong president, can restrain Congress and its spending and its delegation of power to the bureaucracies. Only a president can take charge of the bureaucracy of all of the alphabet soup agencies. And so you saw in several of these proposals, including Hanani's, the idea that, well, the president can just come in and solve everything and just use executive action or emergency authority to achieve the desired result. Now, there's something to be said for executive power. I'm not, we have 3 branches of government. I think they all have a role to play. I would say this, though, there'd be no question in my mind that should a president try to do these things, they'd be immediately challenged in the courts. And so it's not just a simple, arithmetic function that the president does this, you add that, and then you get the outcome you've been seeking. If this executive order were to take place, there would be a whole judicial process that might not get the result that Hanania desires, or in fact, that I desire, because I don't think we should have racial preferences in government contracts either.
Okay. Yeah, go
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Rachel. No, Rachel.
I think I agree with all of that. I think that there's a general there's a lot of tensions in this book between whether we want to dismantle the administrative state or use it to achieve our own ends, whether we want more executive power or whether we actually want less executive power for something more democratic. But I was going to add, underlying all of that, you sometimes get indications that the larger goal, whatever we do, whether we're using more administrative state or less administrative state, the larger underlying goal might be something liberal. Sometimes it sounds like that, but other times there are very serious reasons to doubt that that's actually the goal. So in Hananiah's essay, he sometimes talks about how leftist power is unfairly advantaging certain people over others, but then he says really funny things. So he's talking about labor unions, right? And how labor unions are a corrupt institution. And the whole goal really of Hananiah's essay, or at least the framework of it, is that we need to do this kind of institutional triage, right? We have to look at all the institutions, decide which ones we can redeem, which ones we can not redeem at all. So we just need to try to marginalize them as much as possible. The tone of it is actually not as polemical as some. It's trying to be sort of practical and somewhat even-handed, but that actually makes some of the things he says even more interesting because he just sort of says them in this offhand fashion. He doesn't even seem heated. This is just how he thinks about the world, right? So he's talking about labor unions and he says, well, labor unions are a pretty corrupt institution. We're probably going to need to put those in the marginalized category, right? Just try to give them as little power as possible. But he says, we should maybe make an exception for the police and the firefighters because he says they disproportionately attract high testosterone men, and thus they're an exception and should be treated as such. But then he explains the problem in general is that labor unions exist to gain special privileges for their own members, even if that means restricting the freedom and hurting the economic prospects of others. So okay, so police and fire unions don't do that? or is the suggestion that somehow high testosterone men are naturally resistant to a liberal agenda, so we can trust them more? Or what exactly is the argument here? But clearly a lot of people are going to read this and say, it really seems like you're very partial to particular groups, and for you, liberalism, even where you bring it up, is kind of a fig leaf for representing certain people that you just think naturally should be in positions of power or have greater influence.
Okay, so Shelley, I think we're gone or about half an hour. Have some questions started to accumulate?
We do. We have quite a few people on the queue already. Jerry Raymond, if you would like to unmute, you can ask your question.
Yes, I just wanted to know whether it is useful in the context of this discussion to double down on Frank Meyer's Fusionism as a proper articulation of what belongs in principled American conservatism.
Matt, you want to take the first shot at that one?
Well, I think it's a great question and a great point. I actually think that a lot of our discussions of the new right have forced us into a recollection of Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer, a founding figure of the American conservative movement, a man who had been very familiar with the left, having been a member of the Communist Party, who was transformed by his encounter with Friedrich Hayek and the road to serfdom. Became the books and arts editor at National Review, but eventually kind of morphed into the major theorist of National Review. Bill Buckley used to call Frank Meyer air traffic control because he made sure all the planes were in order and would all land on time. And Meyer's idea of fusionism, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, was the idea that American conservatism is unique because at the American founding, traditionalists and libertarians hadn't parted company yet. That didn't happen until the 19th century. And so American conservatives can look to the American founding and see a conservatism in which traditionalism and libertarianism freedom and virtue work together and are in balance, and one shouldn't favor one side more than the other. And I like the fact that the debate we've been having on the right has forced many people to go back to Meyer. There's a new online publication called Fusion, after Meyer's idea. And I do think it's true that what we should aim at is what we've seen in the American experience. And that's what Meyer, I think, needs to be recognized for. It wasn't so much that he was just coming up with this theory on his own. He viewed himself as just simply describing the way American conservatives acted. And for most American conservatives he encountered, freedom and virtue went hand in hand. And I think that should continue to be our goal on the right today.
Yeah, Jerry, I would say that if you read this book, what might occur to you is that it expresses Fusionism, because every time the term libertarian comes up, it is used as an epithet. It's a negative. And certainly on economic issues, on immigration, on trade. So it sounds like very much like, again, Fusionism, breaking the coalition apart, in particular discarding the libertarians. Okay.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had exactly that same thought about Fusionism, and I think there is a sense in which this book could be described as fighting tooth and nail to avoid coming back to Fusionism, because I think it does clearly show that the concerns that the people on the new right have are still those same old concerns, right? The administrative state is too big, and that's impeding our freedoms and ways of life that we wish to continue, and we're worried about our culture, and we need to reaffirm traditional morals. Those were always the concerns that animated Fusionism, and we still have them. But one thing that's interesting is that a lot of the mood of this book reflects disappointment with where the right has gone, with this general perception that it's divided and ineffective. And I kind of agree with that. But I think the contributors to this book may need to ask themselves, is it possible that not really the new right itself necessarily, but that Trumpian populism, the populist takeover, is one reason for that? Why is it, given that really this sort of fraying of the coalition, the breakup of the coalition, happened kind of a long time ago now, right? Like, it's been several years that they've had a lot of power on the right. So is it possible that one of the reasons we aren't achieving these objectives is because of their postures and their insistence on eroding the coalition? But I think that what's really happened here is that at that moment, at that sort of populist moment, they wanted to use that fission power, the breakup of the coalition, as a sort of way of launching something new. It hasn't gone very well, and they're frustrated about that. And so they're hoping, if they just keep killing the old right, that they can get that resurgence of energy that can give them the new movement that they were hoping all along. But at some point in time, you just have to come back and say, why is this not working? Is it possible that those older ideas were actually pretty good?
Thank you, Jerry. Ben, if you would like to unmute.
Sure. So my question is really sort of, to what degree are simple fixes available for what seems like a catastrophic list of indictments? And if you just said we will have Canada's immigration policy and we maybe take a Hananian approach to kind of disparate impact, is that 80% of the charges against, the failure of America? Or does that even not get us there in the kind of new rights view?
That's another great question. I would support both policies, and I'm just trying to work out the fact that I would support them might actually make the new right rethink them. So it's that whole quality of Fusionism that we described in the answer to the previous question. What is it actually that they want? And I think it would depend on the contributor to the volume we're discussing. It may just be that for some people on the new right, that if you had Canada's immigration policy, they'd be satisfied. Or if you fix the border, right, then they'd be satisfied. It may just be that if we actually treated disparate impact for what it is, which is, in my view, a bad theory and doesn't get you anywhere, and probably unconstitutional too. I mean, violating the idea of equal protection. Maybe that would satisfy some pieces of it. I do think, though, for some other thinkers on the new right, it's much deeper. The Anton essay here is an essay of someone in cultural despair. It literally, one of the parts of this essay is that the people are corrupt. America is corrupt. And that is a type of rhetoric that one associated, at least I did until recently, with the new left of the 1960s, the anti-American left of the 1960s and 70s. And it was quite surprising for me to see it now popping up on the right. I don't think any policy will satisfy that idea. If you think that America as a country is fundamentally over, right? But I do think that there are some policy fixes that, if we were to adopt them, could contribute to patching this coalition together in a productive way.
Okay,
I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Rich.
Oh, I was just going to say, I won't add too much to that. I will just say that actually what was interesting about Jeremy Carl's essay is that many of his concrete suggestions are fine and would probably be appealing to most conservatives. But actually what's most troubling about it is just the tone. And I think this is often the case with immigration, where you have to say, immigration is not the sort of problem that lends itself to simple and complete fixes. There are hard moral questions there. That doesn't mean that we can't generate reasonable policy, right? We can say, well, there's going to be hard moral questions. Whatever policy we have, there are going to be some sad cases where you can bring those to light and say this isn't really the result most of us would have wanted or something, because it's hard, right? There are lots of very poor people in the world who would like to be Americans. We can feel sympathy for that and also recognize that we can't let them all come here, right? So any policy that you devise is going to have some unhappy features. What's troubling about the Carl essay is that it just has this kind of militant, we must win at all costs kind of tone to it. And for me, at least, that is pretty off-putting when you're talking about immigration, right? I at least want us to be able to say, yeah, sometimes people can't come here, but, we can at least acknowledge that they're people, and that's too bad, that we can't let them all come here. If you can't do that, then I start worrying that there's some deeper dehumanizing element to this that does bother me.
So let's talk a little bit about, because I think that you brought up an important issue of the tone and style. We seem to be in an era of winner take all politics. When I was younger, if a major piece of legislation got through, it had some bipartisan support. I mean, think of the '64 Civil Rights Bill as an example. Then we get to more recently, Obamacare just gets rammed through with a simple majority. And is the new right kind of saying the politics of compromise, of cross-party coalitions is over, and we're in an era of winner take all politics? Let's face up to it and let's win. Is that their tone? Is that their message? And if so, is it right or wrong?
I think they see themselves as copying the techniques of the progressive left. And so the new right criticism of the old right, so-called, is that it plays too nice, that it's not, the old right isn't aware of the threat, the danger, the moment, and so confines itself to the typical bargaining, rule of law, negotiation, compromise model of governments. Whereas the new right would advocate for conservatives to simply mimic progressives, whether that's through executive power grabs, whether that's through in some cases, using the bureaucracy to legislate via rules. Certainly, there's some elements of it, the foreign policy of the new right that reflect kind of what the progressive left was talking about in foreign policy not too long ago. So I see it almost as a reflection. My issue is, does it conform to the Constitution and the Declaration and the ideals and institutions of this country, which as an American conservative, I want to defend? And so we can have policy debates, but they need to take place within this carapace of the constitutional order and the rule of law. And to the degree that the new right goes beyond that, I would oppose it, just as I would if the progressive left was going beyond it.
I would add that there actually is a lot of difference among different essays in this book. We're responding to kind of the more militant among them for good reasons, but I think there actually are some contributors who are a little different. I don't think Carson Holloway is really on some big crusading bandwagon. David Goldman makes concrete suggestions. You might not agree with them, but I think he's making arguments for what he thinks should be different about our economy. They're not really straw man arguments in his case. I liked Joshua Mitchell and Aaron Wren's essay on basically, it's interesting. They talk about how Catholics and Jews did sort of the bulk of the work building the intellectual foundation of the conservative movement, but they're not really critical of Catholics and Jews. They're basically trying to call fellow Protestants to step up to the plate and contribute more. So I thought that was an interesting essay. So not everyone in the volume is on the warpath, but what's interesting is among those who do seem the most militant, frequently, so Yenner, Azarad, Andrews, when they explain what they want us to fight for, you read those and say, how many people are you going to get on board with you, right? The versions of conservatism or traditionalism, I guess it's not conservatism, the visions that they want to advance seem so revanchist and so sort of extreme that it's really hard to see where they're going to get any traction with any but a tiny minority, right? So in that case, then yeah, it seems like a very imprudent approach.
Okay, Shelley.
Thank you, Ben. Tom Gray, you are on deck.
Hi, thanks for so far very interesting talk. And I have a question I'd like to ask after a pre-question, which is a comment about Ramaswamy's idea of 8-year term limits for bureaucrats, which I fully support. And you've mentioned the deep state. And I think in one of your articles, you talked about Trump's failure to drain the swamp. But I think that the 8-year term limit is one of the best and plausible possible ways to do that. So I'd like some comments on that. But on the bigger question about the managerial elites, GOPs, have failed to protect the family. Most Republicans who are married do feel the GOP-E is failing to protect them. And it does seem to me that a lot of internal US problems are related to kids not being raised by married parents. And I think there's a lot of social science about that that's not really talked about. And my question is, are there any policies being offered in this book, which I'm almost certain not to read after listening to you guys a great talk, which I thank you for, but were there any policies to support families that you thought were realistic?
Rachel, you want to try that one first?
Well, I could take the second part of it and I'll leave the first.
Yeah.
Matt can talk about Ramaswamy. I got nothing to say.
Well, I'm happy to talk about Ramaswamy, and maybe I'll just touch on the second part too. But the time limit for work in the federal government, it seems reasonable. I'm not so sure whether that would shrink the deep state, because you'd have a continual inflow of employees And then, of course, one thing we know about Washington, and I say this as someone who was born and raised in Northern Virginia, but through my life, I've observed when people come to Washington, they never leave. So they'll just, they'll find other work as well. So it's certainly worth thinking about. Maybe just shrinking the government would be a more effective means of limiting the deep state, and also having the judiciary and Congress rein it in. On the family, I'm glad we're returning to that subject, which we opened the discussion with. I don't think anyone knows how to save the family other than to start one and to make it work. Moynihan wrote...
I do have 4 kids, but we do live in Slovakia.
Okay, well, and that's wonderful. And that there are people with 4 kids here in the United States. Moynihan had his report on the African-American family in 1965. The trends that he's observed there have now become visible in all communities. Charles Murray saw them happening in white America in 1993. And yet no public policy seems to have been able to change that trend on either the right or the left. And there might be a few things we can do on the margins, but it seems to me that no one has a good answer on this, I agree, very important matter.
So yeah, I agree. It's very important. I think we are going to need to keep thinking about it and considering what can actually be done. And there are some interesting conversations happening about things like pronatal policies. And I'm not going to go too deep into this. I'm really conflicted about pronatal policies. There's things that I like about them and things that I don't like. And I really think the entire world is trying to figure out, do they work? What are going to be the consequences of having basically government giving more money to support families in various sorts of ways? So they don't really talk about that in this book, but there are people out there who talk about it. Brad Wilcox and the Institute for Family Studies is one place to go if you want to read sociologists who are conservative really in their orientation, but very much in favor of things like pronatal policies. You can find their arguments there if you're interested in that question. In this book, the policies that are mentioned mostly involve attacks on feminism and basically a sort of fundamental belief clearly that women's opportunity is the biggest problem. You have in the chapter from Scott Yenner, he talks about how back in the time of the founders, they had a better view on this. And he has this really kind of amazing quote where he favorably characterizes the founders period. And I'm not saying that the founders didn't have plenty of wisdom in their own way, but this was, of course, a very different time. And it just was amazing is that Yenner wants to characterize this favorably in a way that's obviously recommending it as something that we should consider and possibly imitate. And when he describes that, he actually says, the ideal such as it was of public man, private woman, reigned in law and culture. The founders' sexual constitution was supposed to link natural desires to a Republican Christian society that allowed for natural growth and responsible parenthood. The sexes would be separate for some of their daily lives, but they came together for common purposes. Men would have suitable outlets in commerce and politics, while women would raise children, mind the home, and build the community. And then he adds, men owned the family property in their own name, controlled the family finances officially, and were the voting representatives for the family. I'm not sure if he really actually is trying to suggest we should go that direction in policy, but I don't really see that going well in America today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We have another one, Yuri.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I have a quick comment. So Matt, I feel that you might be conflating a little bit conservatism a little bit with the Republican Party. I tend to think of conservatism in terms of worldviews, ideas, and policies, but political parties are primarily there to win elections. And when I hear in the same sentence you say conservatism, comma, Republican Party, my brain gets confused because I don't know if we're going to be talking about maybe partisanship and the back and forth, or we're going to be talking about ideas. So broadly speaking, how do you see the difference in looking at discussing conservative ideas in general versus whatever current positions of any given party?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I may have skipped a few bases, stolen a few bases while I did talk about this in shorthand. You're absolutely right. The Republican Party, it's a political party, it's an institution, it's a vehicle. Born in the 1850s, still viable today, hosting many different persuasions and attitudes and policy agendas. However, beginning in the 1920s, the Republican Party essentially became the home to American conservatism. That is, the opponents of the New Deal found their way to the GOP. This is a long period of evolution, but by the time you get to 1964 and Barry Goldwater's nomination, the conservative movement had established a beachhead in the Republican Party, and the GOP was thought to be the vehicle for conservative policies and ideas. And that continued through Reagan, that continued through George W. Bush, and that continued through Trump as well. So if you think of it as a series of concentric circles, you have those ideas, the conservative intellectuals at the center, but they're the smallest piece. The broader circle is what I call the conservative movement, and those are the activists and also the single issue groups, taxpayer rights, guns rights, pro-life. And then the largest is the Republican Party. And at their best, I think, they have worked together. But to your point, we find more and more they operate along different axes and are trying to spin off in different directions.
Oh, appreciate it. Thank you. So it's a quick follow-up. So do you see any strands in the current liberalism that conservatives of today could align with?
There on the left, just briefly, and Rachel probably has some thoughts on this too, but there is a group of liberals who have become very alarmed at the direction of the progressive left. It's racialism, its embrace of kind of bizarre gender theories and theories of sexuality. It's cancel culture and its attempt to suppress dissident views. And they have, I think, broken off to some degree, and they are natural allies for an American right. And that's a trend, I think, to be encouraged.
Yeah, you give me a nice opportunity for self-promotion, because I just interviewed Yasha Monk on his new book on identity politics. That'll be at Law and Liberty's site, that podcast, in next week, I think. And I also reviewed that book for National Review. He's an example of what Matt's talking about, somebody that's clearly on the left, but is genuinely really worried about some of those developments. And I think wants to make friends with conservatives who also want to promote democracy and some form of liberalism, and really wants us all to be able to live together, right? So I think there are people like that. In this book, I was going to say, to your first question, one perpetual frustration is that they can't seem to decide whether they want to have deep, hard, real conversations about difficult questions, or whether they just want to say, the time for talk is over, we just need to take no prisoners, right? And those are not terribly compatible goals. Obviously, we need to do some walking and chewing gum on the right as a whole, but we need to exercise some discernment and recognize, where do we have good answers that we just need to find better ways of promoting through the political system? And where is the problem that our answers haven't been good enough, right? Or we haven't ever generated any? Where do we actually just need to be having searching conversations and coming up with better answers? You need to discern which questions fall into which bucket. And I think they haven't done that at all effectively. They want to simultaneously be the bringers of truth and also the effective leaders of the movement. And I just don't think that it works very well when you can't get those things straight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. Jack, are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
fantastic.
Excellent. So I think I respectfully disagree with the panelist on Russia. I'm more of Anton's state of mind to the extent I understand it. I wonder, I've had this a long story, which you won't have time for, but what is the end game of current policy? In two respects in particular. First, is there a new military doctrine regarding a surrogate war against a nuclear power? In Korea and in Vietnam, the United States was very careful not to get engaged with China and Russia. And second, now that Putin is allied with Xi and meeting with Kim, and the BRICS are expanding to 11 and having a long wait list, I wonder, we're going to end up with a world where it's the West, if we can keep France and Germany with us, and there's some sounds that they're not entirely happy with US policy. Is it going to be the West against the rest of the world that wants out of the dollar and US rules and sees the US as a bully?
Well, good news, according to Anton, foreign policy is easy. It is easy to develop a geopolitical strategy. The only thing that's hard is persuading the establishment to adopt it. So get the book, and it's very simple, actually, to come up with a good approach to foreign policy.
What is the approach?
Oh, well, I don't want to summarize all of the pieces, but basically he has a lot of fairly conventional attacks on excessive interventionism. And then I think he basically wants a kind of balance of power approach where we allow Russia to control its sphere and also China, just as long as they sort of stay within their zone, and then we sort of recognize what is our appropriate.
No, but I'm not asking what's Anton's approach. I'm asking what is the approach of the advocates of current policy towards Russia, Ukraine, the neocon position? What is the end game? What is the solution?
I mean, the solution from the advocates of continued military assistance to Ukraine is to assist Ukraine in ejecting Russia from its sovereign territory, which Russia has illegally annexed beginning in 2014. And that entails our continued military support. It also sometimes, and some critics of the Biden administration criticize the Biden administration for not authorizing enough aid, certain weapons platforms that would have allowed Ukraine to launch this counteroffensive earlier and perhaps conduct it more effectively. I do agree. The ultimate end game is unclear. We have not had anyone, including the president, kind of lay out what happens if Ukraine fails to recapture its territory. And there are legitimate concerns about what happens. Does Ukraine get an invitation to join NATO? Does the West commit to security guarantees for Ukraine in order to prevent a resurgence of the war? If Russia is left on occupying parts of Ukrainian territory? So this lack of leadership is definitely to be concerned over. I would just say, I don't think that it's America's actions that have forced Russia into partnership with Xi Jinping. I think it's the nature of the Russian regime and the Chinese regime that have made them natural allies now for going on. I think the Shanghai Communique was in 1998 even. So for decades, they've felt that they had an alignment of interest even before this unlimited partnership was declared on the eve of the invasion.
So anyway, nothing like getting a 30-minute question at the last minute. So sorry, Jack, but that's probably something that we could debate and try to argue about for a long time. All right, but thanks, Matt, and thanks, Rachel. I thought that was a very great discussion. People really stuck with it.
Appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you for your time. And everybody, please be on the lookout for the next From the Shelf with Arnold Kling. We will announce that early next month. Thanks so much.